Without him, we can do nothing. There is a difference between being self-centered, self-focused, and God-focused. Be whatever you want. Keep in mind that in here what we're talking about is simply this. If we are self-focused and self-centered, it is the enemy of experiencing God. You will not experience God. If that's our objective, we're saying we cannot get there if we are self-focused. How so? Can you prove that biblically? Well, let's move into some illustrations. Take a look at it. One of the greatest illustrations of this isn't even New Testament, it's Old Testament. And it's a perfect example of what we're talking about in looking at someone who is self-centered life-wise and someone who is God-centered life-wise. And that story is a man named Abram. And of course, this is before he became Abraham. There's a little play on words, Abram being the father or the elder of the family, and Abraham, the father of many. So we have Abram, we have his nephew, Lot. And we all know how that story goes. They start off, God says, go to a land, I will show you. Off they go, the two of them together. And you know what? They're blessed. And they're even blessed materially because they both develop large flocks. And we're talking money. That's the money of the day, livestock. Trouble is they're staying together. There's only so many resources, and they're both trying to use the same resources. Not surprising, their underlings, their shepherds, are starting to get into trouble with each other. Yeah, as if that doesn't happen among church people, sometimes. But they're getting in trouble with each other because they're competing for the resources. So Abram comes to his nephew Lot and proposes this. Please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we're brothers. Is it not the whole land before you? Just picture these guys are on this hill, this tell somewhere looking. There is all the basin of what would be Israel, the Canaanite land laying before them. Here it is, and they're standing and looking from this hillside, and they're looking over the land, and he says, please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifts up his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go towards Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, promised land over that way. And Lot dwelt in the city of the plain. And so far it sounds pretty good, doesn't it? If your business was livestock and you were on that hill, what would you choose? Wow, there's the well-watered side, everything. It looks like God's garden over there. God must want me to go that way. Off he goes. Sounds good until we hit this line. And he dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. Now, just in case we didn't catch the drift of this, the next line says, but the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. Stop for a moment and just think, what was the basis of Lot's decision? Was it self-focused, self-centered, or God-centered? He raised up his head and his eyes, and he looked and he said, my eyes tell me this is a great land. My future business strategy is over in this direction. And it was not a bad decision until you get to the last line. A little compromise, though. The men over there are wicked. Not only are they wicked, they're exceedingly wicked. The only little thing here is, the only little flaw is that God's not over there. God came in a distant second in the filters there, didn't he? The thing was a focus. So Lot does everything else seemed great. Garden of the Lord, it looked at. He had himself convinced, so off he goes. Well, in hindsight, it's easy for us to say. But I wonder if we were on that hillside, what we might have done. So off he goes, and we follow Lot's progress. Go down a few decades. Man, Lot has done okay. He might have even thought, kind of like we may in churches sometimes, well, you know, I'll raise my family right, and he does. How he did that in Sodom, I don't know. but he did. He raised some daughters. His wife was happy with the standard of living. Things were going well. She was happy there. He became an elder in the city gate, so he was like a statesman. And maybe when he went there, he thought, I can handle this debauchery here. As a matter of fact, I will get high in the ranks and change things. He could have thought of 1,000 things. But the thing is, at the root of it was this: they were wicked. We know that, in fact, they were so wicked, they were beyond redemption. So it was a wicked place. He goes on, here is the problem. For all the rationalizing that Lot might have done, when there's something rotten at the root, by golly, it's going to come to the surface. It might take 20 years like it did in his life, but eventually it's going to come to the surface. So how does it work for Lot in this situation? We move on, Genesis chapter 19, verse 1. Now 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. He was in his office as a statesman. That's where he would be, at the gate. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. Keep this in mind. Lot is not an ungodly man. He had the sensitivity. This is all about knowing where God's working and experiencing God. Lot saw these guys, and he knew they were holy men. He knew it. And he said, "Hear now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way." He's telling us 2 things here. He knows they're holy, and he's telling, I got to get these guys out of town as quick as I can, because this is not a holy place. His head wasn't in the sand. He knew what was going on here. And then you may rise early and go on your way. And they said, "No, but we will spend the night in the open square." Oh, talk about baiting. But he insisted strongly, so they turned in to him and entered his house. Why would they spend time in the square? Why would they even say that? See what Lot says this time. Because the city square was like the heart of the city. It would tell you what the nature of that city was. And we know later on what happens in this story. And can you imagine if these guys would have spent their time in the city square? It wouldn't have been a good thing. Lot knew this, and he strongly encouraged them, please come and stay at my house, because he didn't want to see that happening. He was still godly enough to realize that. Then they came with him, and they made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. And they called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, so we may know them carnally." Skipping down a little bit, because we know that the angels really protect themselves. But then we hit the point of the whole thing. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here? Son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, take them out of this place. For we will destroy this place, because the outcry against them has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." All that work, 20 years of raising in the ranks and getting along with these people, and God comes, and Lot essentially loses everything overnight. He loses everything overnight. All started when he looked over the land and looked at it with his own eyes. On the other hand, take Abram to become Abraham. He leaves and follows God. He follows from his home and then in Haran, and he lives in Canaan. He tries to follow where God is going. And we know Abraham's story too. Abraham messed up, didn't he? He tried to make God's promise happen, and Ishmael comes in this story. So Abraham, and this is important to realize, Abraham did not live the life with God perfectly. But you know what he did do? He lived it consistently. Even when he messed up, he picked himself up and kept going in the direction, because the whole idea was to stay in step with God. It's amazing. So what do we do when we fail at something? Well, we can lay there and beat ourselves up, but God doesn't say that. He says, I still have a promise. Get up and keep going. If I forgive you, you have no authority not to forgive yourself. Get up and keep going. It's not about time. It's time spent consistently. Genesis 18:17, we find out what this does for Abraham. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him, for I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. Remember last week, we were building on a truth from last week. We looked at it with the T. In him, we will bear fruit. Without him, we can do nothing. And it all based down on relationship. And do you remember the diagram with the working of God we did? We saw that it's not a straight line. It was God gives you invitations. You have a relationship with him. That relationship's enough for God to invite you to work where he's working. And then if we happen to turn aside, like Moses at the burning bush, if we turn aside and follow God a few steps, he reveals more. And then if we follow a few more steps, he reveals even more. And that's what this is all about. Abraham may not have followed God perfectly, but he followed him. And he did it in a consistent way. And now God has this great promise, and he's revealing what's going to happen that just blows Abraham away. We know that. But think of how this worked out. See, we might say when I first read those two lists, and you think, here's self-centered and here's God-centered. Well, self-centered sounded pretty reasonable to me. People should have confidence in all of these things. God-centered sounded good, but it sounded idealistic. But the truth is, it's really the opposite when you look at how it plays out. Because following God, a God-centered life, is actually the one that's practical. Look at these lives. If I just said the name Lot, what do you think of? Probably you would think of Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe you'd think of his wife as a pillar of salt. You would think of a guy who lost everything. That's what will probably come to mind. Here's the legacy. If I say the name Abraham, you probably think the exact, the father of many. The reason we're in here right now at this very minute is in large part because of Abraham. Because he was God-centered. What he did saw the promised land come into being. The promised land led to the Messiah, and the Messiah ultimately leads to you and I in here talking about this morning. So 4,000 years, and that's the legacy we know from Abraham. It can look good the other way, but the outcome is usually not all that good. And it can happen in churches, so easy. It can happen in your life. We can rationalize, we can say, to my eyes, this looks pretty good. I think I'll go this way. And we do it all the time, I know. But our perspective isn't God's perspective. Lot teaches us that. So how do we have the relationship that we know? How does this come about? Because it comes down to relationship. Consider this line from Jesus himself. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. There's not a big checklist or anything there. It's just, my sheep know my voice, and they follow me. That's relationship. And as we were talking in the first service, it's an amazing thing to see. Anybody who's seen this, you get this mishmash of, say, 2 or 3 herds together or flocks of sheep, and they're all bang, and everything's going, it's chaos. And then the shepherds leave, and they each have their own little call, and like magic, all the sheep just divide off into following their shepherd. They just know. That's where we have to be, is in this relationship, is to be in the relationship enough to know. That means we've got to build one in the first place. I'm telling you this, in building a relationship with God, it's not just time, it's consistency. Not just time, it's consistency. It's when you fall down, you dust yourself off, you let God pick you up, and you go at it again, because the objective is still to be with God. What kind of practices are involved in this relationship? And I use the word practices, I could say disciplines. It's not a checklist, it's a way of doing life. So it's not as easy as saying well, A, B, C. That's how we kind of laid it out in the Old Testament. It's a practice. And even those who had a relationship with God in the Old Testament saw it beyond any laws. Let me throw you, this would be kind of fun to do. If I were to ask of one name that you might think of as this person was the epitome of the entire Bible of somebody who had a relationship with God, what name would you come up with? I'm just curious. Ezekiel? Yeah, he had a relationship, all right. Job? It's interesting because Job has a relationship, and that name came up too when we were talking earlier, but Job's relationship was given to us in a very particular slant, how our relationship is in real trial. So Job is a good one. Ezekiel's a good one. Jonah. I'd say Jonah's one that could have used work on his relationship, but it is. Yeah, everyone knew. But there is one person who is known for being after God's own heart. Ah, there we go. Yes, all these people had a relationship. But if you think about it, the person who was known for his relationship, the only time the term is used, as far as I know or remember, is David, after God's own heart. And that's no accident, because if you mentioned Job, the whole writing of that book is all about affliction and everything. If you look at the writings of David, they're all about his heart. It's more like this when David was on his off time, when nobody was looking, this is what he was thinking. You know, the Psalms are all about David when no one else was around but him and God. No accident that that is one of the longest books in the Bible. You know what Psalms is? It's one big illustration of here's what a relationship with God looks like. This is how you do the relationship. So this is what I would like you to do. You don't have to read a thing or follow along. Just kind of sit back and let these words wash over you. And they're all from different Psalms. They're all just different words of how David was doing and feeling. And see how that makes you feel. See what impression you pull from it. Starting with this. He, that is the wise person, does not sit in the seat of the scornful. Be angry, but do not sin. Meditate within your heart on your bed and be still. I will praise you, O Lord, with my whole heart. I will tell of all your marvelous works. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. I will declare your name to my brothers. I will come into your house in the crowd, in the multitude of your mercy. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. As for me, I will walk in my integrity. To you I will cry, O Lord, my rock, do not be silent to me, lest if you are silent to me, I become like those who go down to the pit. O taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who trusts in him. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. My soul, you have said to the Lord, you are my Lord. My goodness is nothing apart from you. I cried out to you, O Lord, and to the Lord I made supplication, meaning very serious prayer. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust. Some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. As for me, I will see your face in righteousness. I shall be satisfied when I awake in your likeness. He's speaking of what he pulls from life. I will be satisfied when I awake in your likeness. I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not wickedly departed from him. Your word I have hidden in my heart, that I may not sin against thee. I delight in the word of the Lord. I meditate on it day and night. There's a whole lot of things of not just David's heart in there. There's a whole lot of things of here's how you do it. Here's how you do the relationship. There was the meditating from the heart. There was the whole heart involved. There was the walking with God wherever. There was the praise that went on. There was the singing that went on, all declaring God's glory and what he has done. There was the encouragement to go and taste him. In other words, to experience him. There was serving God. There was fearing God, but not fearing the evil. How often do we get those ones backwards? There was keeping his word. There was hiding his word in your heart. There was delighting in his word. In every aspect of David's life, every hour, everything he was doing, everything focused through who God was, and then whatever came out of that. That was his top filter. I wonder how seriously we really take that. How many Christians really feel that, in life, if I want satisfaction, the satisfaction for my life is I will awake in the likeness of God. Wow, what would happen if we had one church, just everybody believing that one thing, awaking in the likeness of God? His word I will hide in my heart, because that's how I will not sin against him. Now, just to quantify something a little bit, just to point something out, and I know there's a lot of latitude to this type of thing, but just as an example, there was an email that went out. Some of you may not even get the group emails. You may get caught in the devil's spam. That's our new word for it. But if it gets through, 141 people are on our mass mailing list. So this invitation went out simply to this, is that the encouragement letter for the midweek, and this isn't to try and browbeat anyone into anything, I'm just presenting some, because you may have a very valid reason if you are or not on this. But the idea is, and the encouragement is simply this: how are you doing trying to memorize the verse, to live in the verse for this week? The one that's coming up comes midweek, just to give you a helping hand. Well, out of 141 in different ways have invited, 30 people. In other words, somewhere around 21% of everyone associated with a church went along with this. I know we can play with numbers. I'm just using a trend. 21%. If that's where we are at any given time, is it any wonder if we don't experience? Is it any wonder? There are things like David that we have to do life with God. There are things that have to be. We have to engage with God in God's way. The relationship builds. Then you hear his voice when he calls. When you hear his voice, then you follow. When you follow, you hear a little more. And as you're following and hearing, then you experience God. Whatever's going on. That's how the whole thing works. That's how we end up waking in his likeness. So what does it look like? What does it look like when a person is actually living the relationship? Well, you told us these things, but what does it end up looking like in our daily life? Well, let's borrow two things from David as we start on this particular question. First is this: David was very acutely aware his goodness was nothing apart from God. His goodness was nothing apart from God. What if we could get that into our heads, that, yeah, we can do all kinds of good things according to the world, but no eternal things. Goodness is only when it's with God. And the second thing was his consistency. If God is your rock, God is your rock. I walk on the ground. Guess how often I walk on the ground? All the time. Gravity makes sure I do. I walk on what's under my feet. I walk on the rock. Did you catch in that particular verse when I read it? He ends with this: lest I go down to the pit. And this is really important because this is on the consistency side. Because how many people are there out there have been a remarkable leader, spiritually speaking, been an example to their neighbors, been wonderful things, and then all of a sudden their life spiritually implodes. And you go, what happened? What happened? Well, What happens is when we start slacking off on the relationship. There are ways that we stay in the delight of the Lord, and the Lord is our... There's this way you stay in the tea. You know, this tea bag could come out at any time. But you know what happens when that tea bag comes out? The relationship with the water has stopped at that point. Well, it's made great tea in its time. Yeah, sure. But you know what? It's no longer in the water. It is no longer in the relationship. And you can implode. Do not kid yourself. You back off from the things that we read from David. You back off on those things, and you are vulnerable lest you go down to the pit, lest your spiritual life just blows up on you. Well, what does it look like? And it's an amazing thing, too, isn't it, when you think of it, because there's no middle ground there. Generally, when somebody has been a strong spiritual leader, if they fall away quicker than they even realize it's happening, you go from being a leader of God to Satan's pawn. You know, at this point, you end up bang, bang, you're one or the other. It's high stakes. It's something to have fear and trembling over this. But what does it look like when we're walking? Is there any way we can kind of quantify a little bit? Paul, the Apostle Paul, had to deal with churches. That's probably one of the reasons that as you read through the epistles, there's a whole lot of turmoil. You read through the epistles, you see pictures of Paul. He's usually bald. Well, probably pulled all his hair out, dealing with us church people, right? That's probably how it happened. So Paul in this wrote, inspired by God, things that said, when these things are happening, you're on track with God. When these things are happening, you're in serious trouble. If he lived in our day, he would go, whoa, dude, you're in serious trouble. So, that went across seriously. All you got to do is say in a serious tone, merely, you can say whatever you want, right? But this is Paul speaking. So I grabbed things and made a list A and a list B that I want you to take to heart. And the list A is, here are the things if you're in step with God. Here are the things if you're in step with God. Not my words, totally from Paul. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, unity of spirit in the bond of peace, activity in the gifts of the Spirit, actively supporting each other, respect for leadership. All these Paul has listed somewhere. There's a list B, out of step with God. He mentions things like this: backbiting, devouring one another, hatred, contentions, jealousy, resentment, outbursts of anger, dissension, spirit of division, cliques, secrecy, favoritism, all in one respect or another. And the thing about this is, no matter what we say, if there's no ifs, ands, or buts, if it's list A, it's this. There's no denying that's T. You know, it's everything about it is T. On the other hand, if it's in list B, say, rationalize, put it in pious words, do whatever we want. But if it's in list B, according to God's word, it's out of step. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. Could be the pastor standing up here, and if you hear me going from list B, that pastor's out of step. It could be somebody in a congregation, that person is out of step. It could be a board, those people are out of step. If it's list A, that's very reassuring. If those things that are in list A are happening, that is bearing much fruit. It's one or the other without exception. Well, you say, well, you know what? If I look at myself, sometimes I'm list A and sometimes I'm list B and sometimes I'm sliding from one to the other. Yeah, sure you are. So am I. So was Abraham. So was David. We make the mistakes. But make no mistake, there is a list A and there is a list B. And we can know when we're sliding to one or the other. And list A only happens when we are in the relationship with God. And this isn't said in a judgment way. It's just that if we're not in list A, you will not experience God. It's as simple as that. If we're locked into list B, God wants to have a relationship, but we can't. Not from that position. It simply won't happen. List A is where we have to be as individuals and collectively as that works. We can be like Lot. Things can seem right, but I tell you what, you've got to see it from God's perspective, or it's not going to work. No exceptions in all of this. It comes down to this. What's your first filter? I know we all slide in trying to navigate this world, but what's your number one filter on the top? Is it through God's eyes or just through your own? If you took that, it's even on your guide sheets if you want to look at it later, all the things that David said, this is how I do life, this is how I do a relationship with God. How many of those things describe the way you do life with God? Thing to ask yourself, how much do you engage? How much are you list A? How much are you list B? It all comes down to this. If the objective is to experience God, either we do those things. You know, I cannot make this cup of tea unless I put the tea bag in the cup.